No, Mr. Murray, he holds a bachelor's degree from University of Michigan, and then he went on to Michigan Law School, where he studied law, obviously, graduating and worked as an attorney for many years, partner in 2 separate firms before he left his practice to join in full-time missionary work here and abroad. He speaks on any given topic and all over the world. Abdu Murray is also a scholar in residence of Christian thought at apologetics at the Josh McDowell Institute of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. And there's so much more to say, but I'm just going to let him say it. So could we welcome Mr. Abdu Murray?
Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction, John, and for your hospitality as well. You and Steve have been great. You'll notice I'm a lawyer, so I pay attention to words, and they matter very much to me. And John said, and a great compliment, that it's the best book he's read this year. It's January 30th, man. It's not like sort of not the greatest compliment in the whole world. No, I appreciate it. No, we had a lot of fun actually recording the podcast for apologetics.com. Talking about the book, and just enjoyed a great conversation. You got a real gem here in John, and just the church and the way in which I think this is an important thing for everybody here. I will tell you, I've been to a lot of places all around the world, and there are churches that are, I think, waking up to the fact that apologetics is no longer a luxury thing. It's no longer the kind of thing where it's, oh, we should know a little bit about how to answer the questions of culture. It's no longer a luxury. Our youth are not asking the questions in church, not because they're being, avoiding the issues. They're not trying to be smart Alex. They're afraid that the church has no answers, and they don't want to embarrass anybody, or they have already found the answers somewhere else. So I'm very excited and enthusiastic about this kind of an event here at a church, where there's a church that is really getting it and understanding that this kind of thing is very important, if not for the sake of your own faith, then for the sake of those who are coming up in the generations. My son is 14 years old. My daughter is 12, and my other daughter is 10. And as I look at my son, and he tells me a story almost every week about an encounter he's had with an atheist friend, a different one, at school, at his public school he goes to, and the questions they're asking, and the way he's able to answer them is really, really interesting, because he has a pretty solid knowledge in apologetics. He's my son, and I told him a long time ago, no questions off limits. And he has this ability to really simplify an issue and speak to his friends. But what's really shocking to me is not that his high school friends are atheists or agnostics. The shocking story to me, and it shouldn't be shocking anymore, it's becoming quite commonplace, is when my 8-year-old came home from school and she told me about her rabidly atheist friend. And I don't mean rabidly like jerky or anything like that. I mean very, very, very vocal about it. I'm like, your 4th grade friend is a vocal atheist? And she said, yeah, we were talking about something, and I mentioned God, and my daughter said something about God, and her friend said, God is dumb. And taking a page out of Greg Kokel's book, I said, did you ask a question when she asked that? What do you mean by that? And she said, yeah, I did, in fact, ask that question. I said, what do you mean God is dumb? Do you mean God lacks intelligence, or do you mean the idea of God is dumb? And her friend said, the idea of God is dumb. My father told me we came from monkeys and all this other stuff. 8 years old. 8. The beauty of it was that another 8-year-old could ask a question like, what do you mean by that? And have an excellent conversation. So this stuff's important, extremely important, and I'm honored to help to kick off what I think is going to be a very impactful series. You've got some great people following me. I'm glad I'm not following any of them. Wonderful to be here with you. I want to get right into it, because what I'd like to do is, if we can, is spend a lot more time in question and answer. My favorite part of this job is question and answer. And I take this very seriously because people answered my questions. I was not raised in a Christian home, and I was a challenger of the Christian faith. Very often I would try to poke holes in Christianity because I was raised as a Muslim, and I thought Christianity was silly, frankly. And when I would raise questions to Christians, they would often have no responses whatsoever, or at least these half-baked responses that I thought of first, and I would say why they were wrong. But as I began to see the credibility of the Christian faith, I began to see its beauty. Not only its beauty philosophically, not only its evidential basis, but also that it mattered existentially. It actually touched the heart, not just spoke to the mind. And given that, I think it's the only worldview that does that comprehensively and does it so powerfully and so well, which is why I find it tragic that we're currently engaged in a post-truth culture that doesn't see its beauty and doesn't actually see Christianity as a false thing. They see it as a morally bad thing or even dangerous. And that's an important thing for us to have to combat in this day and age. So I want to go through a little bit of a heady topic. That's what we're here for. But it might seem at first, when I start to talk, that it might seem a little bit of a downer. And I don't want it to stay that way. Because I'm actually, you'll find this out, I'm actually quite the optimist. You won't think that in the first 15 minutes of me talking today. Like, think, my goodness, that guy's a bummer. But I hope not to be. I hope not to be. But I do want to get to the Q&A, because one of the things, when people were answering my questions, I began to see something in the way Christians who were thoughtfully answering the questions, they were answering them in ways that weren't just answering what I asked. They answered why I asked. And I remember reading in Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, the two verses that really have shaped the way I do ministry no matter where I go. Paul the apostle is speaking, and he says, is writing, and he says, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. In other words, you don't have to be engineer-like in your efficiency. Like, an hour's over, and we got the 4 topics today. Aren't we doing well? I'm not saying that. What he's saying is, get to the questions they're actually asking. Find out what matters to the heart of the person you're speaking to. And then he says, let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt. And then these beautiful words he ends with, so you may know how you ought to answer each person. You are not in the question answering business. You are in the people answering business. He could have said, so you may know how you ought to answer each question, how you ought to answer each controversy. He did not say that. He said how you ought to answer each person. Questions do not need answers. People need them. And people use questions to get them. So answer people, don't answer questions. And I hope to do that towards the end here. It's my favorite thing to do, because real ministry, I think, happens during question and answer periods. And if you're answering questions, that's when real ministry, I think, happens, especially evangelism. But in a post-truth culture, it becomes very, very difficult to answer questions with facts and argument, because in a post-truth culture, we don't care about facts and argument anymore. We've elevated our preferences and our feelings above truth and facts. It reminds me of something that happened to me a while back. I do a lot of international travel for speaking, and I happened to live right next to Canada. I'm in Michigan, and Canada, strangely enough, is the country to my south. The peninsula in Windsor and Leamington area comes underneath Detroit. You know, where this is how Detroit, Michigan looks, and Canada's down here. So oftentimes when I go to Canada to speak, especially in Ontario, I'll drive. I won't fly. Well, this particular engagement was in a place called Wallaceburg. It was a big open-air event. I was preaching at a festival, like a car show or something, and there was like 1,000 people coming to this thing, and I was driving there. It was in the middle of the summer. So I drive to the border crossing. Now, normally I cross over the Blue Water Bridge or the Ambassador Bridge or the Detroit Tunnel, but because of where this particular town was located, I had to go take a car ferry across the Detroit River. But you know, when I say car ferry to a person who's from Michigan, what you think of is a ship that can hold 30, 40, 50 cars. That was not the boat I was on. I was on this little rickety white thing with the paint peeling off of it thing where it held 2 cars total. And I'm telling you, I expected this guy to pull me across the river, Lord of the Rings style, like with the rope kind of a thing. So I get onto the ship, it's not a ship, it's a boat, barely. And so I get on the boat, and the guy says, stay in your car, it's going to be a short trip, it's hot outside, stay in your car. I said, fine, I'll be happy to do that. So I get into the car for the boat ride. I'm horrible with directions. I can get lost in my own backyard. So I'm constantly looking at the GPS, constantly, especially when I'm going and I'm driving internationally. So I happen to look down at my GPS to verify that I'm going to the right place. At the moment I look down, that's exactly when we left the dock. So I didn't see us leave. But because of the car's suspension and the sheer weight of the car, I didn't feel us leave the dock either. So when I looked up, I had that bizarre, sort of nauseating vertigo you have when you're not quite sure if you're moving. You're at an intersection and the bus is next to you and the bus moves forward and you're not quite sure if you're going backward or it's going forward. And you have that momentary panic. What do you do at that moment? You look for a fixed point of reference. You look for a sign or a mailbox or the street or a building, whatever it happens to be. Well, I was in a river. Everything's moving. So there was no fixed point of reference for me. The boat wouldn't help because I'm on the boat. So the nausea and the vertigo lasted for a while. It's when I saw the distant shore ahead, when I saw that, yes, we are in fact getting closer to the shore, that's when I realized we are moving and all the nausea and the confusion went away. Culture is in the river. Our fixed points of reference, they're there. We don't deny that they're there. We think that truth actually exists. We simply are so far off of shore now that we have our sea legs and things are wobbly. And we're not so much in love with the river, so much as now we resent dry land, because when we get on dry land, now we're wobbly. We've left the secure so long ago. I mean, think about the questions we're asking ourselves now. The things that we once thought were foundational, what it means to be human. This is now up for grabs. I'm reading a book by two scientists who are talking about the transhumanism movement, about what it means to sort of rise above being a human or go beyond being human itself. Questions about what it means to be male or female. These things were at once considered foundational. You sort of knew this, and now it's no longer concretized. Then you look at things like what marriage actually means. When does life begin? When does life end? What's going on with various ethnicities? Is race really a thing? All these various questions we're asking. We're telling children at age like 8, you can determine who you are and what you are. And it shouldn't be a surprise to us then when you see a concomitant rise in the level of anxiety among children between the ages of 8 and 15. It's a huge number now. So it shouldn't surprise us because we're telling people at a very young age who are incapable of making decisions about what they want to eat for lunch, let alone who they're going to be. We're telling them, you can decide who you are and we will help you along. In fact, we might even chemically help you along. Irreversibly so, it seems. It reminds me of what happened in the 1980s. Maybe you remember this because some of you are children of the 80s. Some of you have had children of the 80s, I can tell from the audience size and the demographic here. You remember this thing was called Cold War neurosis, or just Cold War sort of a neurotic thing that was happening. Children were waking up in the middle of the night, and they were screaming because they had nightmares that the USSR and the United States had finally made the Cold War nuclear hot. And kids were waking up screaming in the middle of the night, and there was this confusion that was running around. And I remember there was a song written by the band Genesis called Land of Confusion that was addressing this issue and all the confusion we were facing. Do you remember the words? Oh, Superman, where are you now? When everything's gone wrong somehow, these men of steel, these men of power are losing control by the hour. Could that not be written today? That could be written today with all the things we see now, where someone says, I'm the man of steel, or I'm the woman of steel. I'm the one who has the answers for you. Follow me. I'll give you whatever you want. Whatever it is you want, only to realize that we're losing control. We're staying in the river, and we're not even being afloat anymore. Now we're beginning to drown. That's what a post-truth culture actually is. It's a culture of confusion because man has become the center of all things. Protagoras said it centuries ago when he said man is the measure of all things, and now we're still saying it. We've become the measure of all things. We've unchained ourselves from God, as it were, and we're floating about. And we're becoming the measure of all things. As if to prove the point, in 2016, Oxford English Dictionaries names its word of the year. And every year it names a word of the year. I think last year's word was toxic, which is just telling. But the word of the year captures the ethos and the fascinations of the culture for that particular year. And in 2016, the word of the year was post-truth. We've become a post-truth culture. And a post-truth culture is one that elevates feelings and preferences over facts and truths. Now, that's very different, I think, from a postmodern culture. Now, postmodernism looks like post-truth, but it's different. Postmodernism denies objective truth. It denies that objective truth exists. You can argue with somebody who's postmodern because when they say there's no such thing as truth, you can simply say, is that statement true? And then they'll have to realize, if it's true, then it's not true. If it's not true, then why'd you say it? You can argue with someone like that. And I think you're beginning to see some of this stuff die. But post-truth is rising out of the ashes of it because our stubbornness when it comes to truth is part of the human nature. Postmodernism denied that objective truth existed. Post-truth says it does exist, but my preferences and feelings matter more. So the problem with this is that when you give them argument and evidence that contradicts a sort of felt preference, they're going to look at you and say, you know what, that's all well and good, but I don't care. I don't care. How do you do that? How do you respond to someone like that? And why do they have that attitude? Because man is the measure of all things. Protagoras said it, and it started actually with Adam and Eve. When you think about the Adam and Eve story, what is it telling you? It tells you quite a bit, but what it tells you is this. Adam and Eve walked and talked with God in the cool of the day, Genesis tells us. They literally were in communion with the truths, the very source of all truth. And their purpose was to be with God. That was their divine given purpose, to be with God. Their preference was to be God. And Satan comes along and misquotes God, and they misquote God back, and now he knows he's got them, and so they gave in to their preferences more than the truth. In other words, the seeds of a post-truth culture that value preferences over truth were planted in the first garden, and now the tree is fully blossomed and has its own fruit today. Because we are not freedom-seeking people. We are autonomy-seeking people. And they're very different. They're two different things. Os Guinness once said that you can judge the health of a culture by how it engages with its chief virtues. And the chief virtue in the West has been freedom. I mean, that's why we have William Wallace yelling freedom at the end of the movie. That's why we have The Patriot is a hit movie and all these various things. We talk about winning freedom all the time. But we're not talking about freedom anymore. We've lost the ability to talk about freedom. We keep using that word, but I keep hearing Inigo Montoya in my head. You keep using that word, but it's not what you think it means. We use this word freedom, but what we mean is autonomy. Now, bear with me for a moment. Autonomy, without any chains, is a bad thing because it means the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want, to say what you want, to think what you want, to even be what you want, regardless of any boundaries. See, autonomy comes from two Greek roots, autos meaning self and nomos meaning law. So when you're autonomous, you are a law unto yourself. That means there are no boundaries. Here's the problem with autonomy. If I'm autonomous, if I'm a law unto myself, and another person is a law unto themselves, and my preferences matter more than truth, and your preferences matter more than truth as well. If my preferences happen to collide with your preferences, and they clash with them, and we meet in what used to be the civil public square, which is now the gladiatorial arena of public opinion, when our preferences clash and truth is subordinated to our preferences, truth won't decide who's right and who's wrong. What will decide is power. Either the most microphones, the most money, or the most guns. Isn't it ironic then that someone will become enslaved in this whole process? So in our quest for autonomy, we end up shackling ourselves. If we sacrifice truth and clarity on the altar of human autonomy, the rising ashes from the burnt offering will basically just choke the breath out of freedom's lungs. We're not talking about freedom anymore. We're talking about autonomy, and that leads to chaos, which has led to a culture of confusion. What do I mean by the culture of confusion? A culture of confusion is one in which confusion is considered a virtue and clarity is decried as a sin. So you think about this. If you're confused sexually, you're a hero. Let's say if you talk about it and sort of live that way. If you're confused morally, you're progressive. If you're confused religiously, like all paths lead to God kind of a thing, well, then you're tolerant. But if you're certain on sexual boundaries, well, then you're bigoted. If you're certain on moral strictures, you're considered regressive. And if you're certain that there is one path that leads to God and there's good evidence for it, well, that's considered intolerant. So confusion becomes a virtue and clarity becomes a sin. And the reason why confusion becomes a virtue is because confusion obliterates all boundaries. If we're all confused, then no one can say who's right and who's wrong. And that leads to very serious problems. How do you deal with this? Oh, we're clear on one thing, though. Hold on. We are clear on one thing. The one thing we're clear on is that anybody who disagrees with me is Hitler. We're clear on this. I call it the Hitlerization of social commentary. If I have an opinion or a preference and you don't affirm it, you're Hitler or you're Stalin or pick your despot. That's who you're going to be. Now notice what I said. I did not say, if you disagree with me, you're Hitler. What I said was, if you don't agree with me, you're Hitler. You can't even be neutral on a topic. You can't have a measured, considered opinion. If you spend any time thinking about it, let me think about it. Nope, sorry, you're an oppressor and you're against me. And this affects everybody. If you're on the right, only the left tells lies. If you're on the left, only the right tells lies. If you're a centrist, the right and the left are always telling lies. We've Hitlerized everything. We've demonized everybody else. That's the one thing we're clear on. How do you engage with a post-truth culture then that values preferences over truth and then has this vitriol happening? I think there's a couple of great ways to do this, actually. The first one is essentially to point out the consequences of a post-truth culture. Point out the consequences of a post-truth culture. We're increasingly becoming a pragmatic society. I will believe what works. If you tell me what works, I'll sign up for it because it'll help me and it'll be practical. Well, the reality is post-truth doesn't work. So if you can point out the consequences of post-truth, then you can actually point out the next step, which is the hope that comes from embracing truth. So there's two steps, pointing out the problems with it, and then pointing out that truth can lead to freedom, and post-truth only leads to enslavement. So there are a couple of things that happen when a post-truth culture holds sway. The first thing is that we lose all sense of wisdom and all sense of reason, which is really funny and ironic because we're in an age now where we think that scientific enlightenment and all these things are going to get us to the utopia we're looking for, when in reality they won't. Because our preferences are mattering more than truth. Even when scientific fact is established, if it happens to conflict with my preference, well, we ignore it or we lie about it. But when we lose our God-given reason, it becomes a mess. I remember I was speaking to a large group of people about my testimony of how I came from Islam to Christianity. And if you've heard me give my testimony before, you'll notice something. I don't talk about how false Islam was. I don't do that. Because I didn't become a Christian because Islam was false. If Islam was false, I just became an atheist. I became a Christian because the gospel is true. Now, by implication, everything that goes against it, and Islam does, then that would be false. But I don't point that out. What I point out is the truth of the Christian faith. So I was giving my testimony at a men's breakfast, and there was a guy in the front row who was taking really serious, like furious notes. He wasn't mad at me. I mean like furious, like speed-wise, like smoke from the page kind of thing happening there. And if you're a speaker, you know this, is that's kind of the person who's probably going to speak to you first after you get done closing your notes. Well, he was one of the first people. He came up to me and started talking to me, and I love that part as well. He said, I really appreciated the way you didn't disagree with Islam when you were speaking. I'm like, you didn't quite get the point. If I didn't agree with it, I would have stayed that way and saved myself and others a lot of pain. He said, well, I want to show you something. And whenever someone tells you, I want to show you something, buckle up, it's going to be a long one. And it was, but it was a good one. So he had a diagram he had drawn out, and there was a T in the middle of it, a big, scribbled, bold-faced T in the middle of it, with a little circle around it. He says, this represents the objective truth. There is objective truth. I said, good, you and I agree. He says, but we don't know all of it. I said, good, you and I also agree there, because if I knew all truth, I would be God, and I'm not God, so far we're in agreement that I'm not God. Great start. He says, but because we don't all know it, we all have versions of the truth that are equally valid. And he had these little lowercase t's that were surrounding the capital T with arrows pointing towards them. He says, one day we'll be enlightened and we'll become knowledgeable of the whole truth, but until then we're all incomplete and we can't disagree with each other, which is, by the way, a very Buddhist idea. But he thought he was a Christian. So I said, are you telling me all of us have versions of the truth? All of us? He said, yeah. I said, Pol Pot, Idi Amin, Mao Zedong, Hitler. These men all had versions of the truth. These were the words he said to me. I can tell you that I don't prefer their version, but because mine's incomplete, I can't disagree. So I said, well, Hitler's a safe person to disagree with. No one gets mad at you for that anymore. And if they do, they deserve it. He said, no, I can't disagree with anybody. I said, I'm clear on this. Are you telling me you can't disagree with anybody? He said, that's right. I said, sure you can. He said, no, I can't. I said, you just did it. Now, part of that was being a trial lawyer. That helps with that part. But the whole point was this. This is a very well-read guy. We had a long conversation, and I'm summarizing in a very short period of time. But a very well-read, very wise person was willing to sacrifice his God-given considerable wisdom and reason on the altar of his preferences. Do you see what his preferences was? His preference was that we all get along and no one does the hard work of having to disagree with anybody. And he was willing to sacrifice his intelligence for that. I remember walking out, and there he was by his car, and he was muttering to himself, if I can't disagree with anybody, but I disagree with him. He was doing that kind of a thing, right? But this has actual implications in society. It's not just me one-on-one with a guy in a basement somewhere. It has implications even at our universities. You might recall this. In 2015, there was an incident where at the University of Missouri, the football team organized a protest against some racial injustice that was happening on the university campus. And because it's a protest at a major university involving the football team, it garnered some attention, which you want. You want attention garnered for this kind of a thing. Otherwise, if no one pays attention, then it's a bunch of guys in a room complaining. So you want the press there. Well, the press showed up, but there happened to be these so-called safe spaces where the press couldn't encroach upon. But it was never really clear what those safe spaces were. At a public university, it's public. That's why it's called that. And the press shows up, ESPN hires a photojournalist to go, and he starts taking pictures. He's not interviewing anybody. And he's videoing it. And you can see the video on YouTube, I think it's still there. A woman jumps in front of the camera and starts to block his view. And as he's still trying to get his pictures, she says, someone help me get this aggressor out of here. I need some muscle over here. She wanted muscle to forcibly remove a journalist. That woman was a professor at that university, and she taught journalism as part of the communication school. That's a confused culture. When you sacrifice our God-given wisdom, it doesn't have just simply conversational effect. It has societal effect. And someone's going to be the sharp end of the stick when our freedoms start to get trampled on quite a bit. But the next thing that goes, and there's a number of things, I want to speed it along so we can just get to the questions soon. This is one of the most important ones. When we lose and sacrifice truth and clarity on the altar of autonomy, we lose a sense of accountability, and then we lose a sense of human value, which is why we have a Hitlerization of social commentary now. When Protagoras said, man is a measure of all things, you essentially lost the sense of the transcendent and an obligation, a moral obligation to something higher than ourselves. We determined what was moral. And then we started to reduce ourselves down to chemical machines or sophisticated chimps. And then we started to devalue each other quite strongly. It was Tom Flynn, a secular humanist writer, who made this statement. Listen to what he says. Secular humanism maintains that through a process of value inquiry informed by scientific and reflective thought, men and women can reach rough agreement concerning values, crafting ethical systems that deliver optimal results across a broad spectrum of circumstances. That's a very sophisticated way of saying man is the measure of all things. Through a process of value inquiry informed by scientific and reflective thought, we can reach rough agreement concerning values. Here's my question. Have we reached the so-called rough agreement concerning values? Ask anybody who's been on the sharp end of the stick of sexism if we've reached this rough agreement concerning values. Ask anybody who's been the victim of racism. Ask anybody who's simply been treated unfairly in some way. Go to the Middle East and find out just how rough that agreement actually is. With all of our genius and all of our ingenuity and all of our inventions, I mean, this machine, we call these phones for reasons I don't know. I mean, this is a computer that makes calls once in a while. There's more computing power in my little phone that fits in my pocket than in the first rockets that went to the moon. With this kind of ingenuity, have we used this ingenuity to reach a rough agreement concerning values, or have we started to cyberbully each other? Have we submitted ourselves and our women to objectification, to satisfy prurient interests, and to satisfy some baser desires within us? Have we reached this rough agreement? Then you go to a university, like in Middlebury, where Charles Murray, who's no relation, by the way, but Charles Murray is a very lightning rod conservative thinker. And he had to speak to an audience, but because the protests were so violent, he couldn't speak to the audience. He had to speak to a camera. And his image was beamed into another room where the protesters were. And as he left with a woman named Allison Stenger, he walked outside and happened to be there with this other professor, and they both got attacked, violently attacked, at that university. Then you see what happens in California, at Berkeley, and all these different places, and you think to yourself, Tom Flynn says, we'll reach rough agreement concerning values. I'll tell you what we've come to. We've come to agree on the value of being rough. Because there's no more accountability, and there's no more sense of human value. That's why Francesca Minerva and Alberto Giubilini out of Australia can argue with a straight face in a medical journal that parents have the ability and the right to kill a newborn baby, because the baby has no value in and of itself. If it can't cognitively value itself, and the parents don't value the baby, then the baby has no value, because its value is assigned by people. Why? Because there's no transcendent authority above us. We are the authority. And if this glob of chemicals is in our way, well, remove it. Just remove it. So we lose a sense of human accountability. Yuval Harari beautifully captured this. Listen to the words of this secular atheist Jew talking about humanity's search for autonomy resulting in its deification. Listen to what he says in his book, Sapiens. He says, 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was still an insignificant animal minding its own business in a corner of Africa. In the following millennia, it transformed itself into the master of the entire planet and the terror of the ecosystem. Today, it stands on the verge of becoming a god, poised to acquire not only the eternal youth, but also the divine abilities of creation and destruction. We are more powerful than ever before, but have very little idea of what to do with all that power. Worse still, humans seem to be more irresponsible than ever before. Self-made gods with only the laws of physics to keep us company, we are accountable to no one. We are consequently wreaking havoc on our fellow animals and on the surrounding ecosystem, seeking little more than our own comfort and amusement, yet never finding satisfaction. Is there anything more dangerous than irresponsible gods who don't know what they want? There's nothing more dangerous than that. It's not working. Now, that sounds very pessimistic, and I realize that. But I'll tell you this. I've been in open forums, both small and large. We were at Michigan State University, and 9,500 showed up and filled the Breslin Center to ask their questions. And they weren't asking questions in a gotcha sort of way. They wanted to know the answers. Those students wanted to know. Here's my hope. Here's where I find a glimmer of the hope, whether it was at Michigan or Yale or any other places we've gone. I think that our young people have taken a bender on post-truth and preferences, and now they're living in the hangover part, and they're finding it grisly, and they want to answer out of it. Is that the majority of them? I don't know, but I have hope, because there's a significant number who do. How do you offer that hope? Let me go to the hope part, and then we'll conclude, and then I'll take your questions. People often think that the Bible is not an authority on hope and freedom because they see it as this antiquated book written at a very ancient time with people who had different mores and different ideas, and by dusty old people who simply wanted to keep other people down, women and minorities down. That's what they see it as, an anti-freedom book. Here's the reality. The Bible is an anti-autonomy book. It goes against unfettered autonomy because autonomy leads to chaos, which leads to enslavement. And therefore, it's a pro-freedom book. But what do I mean by freedom? How can the Bible be a source of freedom? It has its boundaries. It does. But freedom requires boundaries. It needs boundaries. Otherwise, it's autonomy and it's bedlam. We're blessed with having a big backyard in my house. When we bought our house, I only had one child at the time. I have 3 wonderful kids, but my son Yusuf was barely a year old at the time. When we were thinking about buying this house, my wife and I were looking at the backyard, and it was huge. But the problem was it backed up to a main road. And there was cars and trucks whizzing by constantly. Now, we were nervous because when the kids get older, they want to play in the backyard. And if they play in the backyard, the ball will bounce into the street eventually, and kids being kids won't look, and they'll get pulverized. So in order for our kids to enjoy the purpose of the backyard, we had to have a boundary beyond which they could not play. In other words, the boundary gave them the freedom to enjoy the purpose of the backyard. Purpose and freedom often go, in fact, actually inextricably go hand in hand. And a boundary is there to protect our freedom, not to limit it. There can be too many, but it's important to have just enough. And we think of these things very often, like even in terms of art. We think art is boundless. Artistic license is, boundless. Not true. Chesterton once said it this way. He says, art is limitation. The essence of every picture is the frame, after all. He says, you may feel that in your artistic way, you may want to draw a giraffe with a short neck, only to find you've not drawn a giraffe at all. You may free things from incidental characteristics, but not from fundamental characteristics, he goes on to say. You may try to free a tiger from his bars, but you dare not free a tiger from his stripes. You try to draw a camel with no humps, only to find you have freedom from being a camel at all. Everything has limitations. The Bible has its strictures, its limitations, whether it's on moral things, whether it's on activities, whatever it might be, because it's protecting that which is sacred. It's protecting purpose in the first place. The Bible is a source of freedom, and I would say Jesus is the central source of all freedom. Let me read to you a passage of Scripture, and then we'll move quickly to a close here. It's a familiar passage. Everyone's probably read it numerous times, but in John chapter 8, verses 31 to 36. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Coupling number one, knowledge of truth is linked with freedom. Truth and freedom are inseparable. Truth and freedom are inseparable. The culture tells you preferences lead to freedom. Jesus says truth leads to freedom, and truth has a boundary. It keeps out that which is false. That's the first thing. Now, their response to him is hysterical, in my view. They said to him, "We are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it you say you will become free?" You are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. Do you recall that whole Egypt thing? 400 years of it. You celebrate your liberation from it every single year at Passover, and by the way, they're making that statement while under Roman occupation. Here's the point, though. Preferences are so powerful that they often blur you from seeing the truth right in front of your face. Right in front of your face. And Jesus, in his way, answers them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The Son remains forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." Second coupling. Son sets you free. So did you see it? The truth will set you free. The Son will set you free. The Son is the truth. Now, that's the kind of thing you don't just say. You had to back that kind of thing up. And they asked him to back it up in John chapter 2 when they asked him, "What authority do you do these things by? Who do you think you are," basically? Reasonable question. And Jesus gives them a reasonable answer. Verifiable. He says, when you destroy this body, this temple, meaning his body, he will raise it up again in 3 days. That was either true or false. An opinion and preference had nothing to do with it. If he died and stayed that way, there's no reason to trust him. If he died and rose again, there's every reason to trust him. I can tell you I've done my debates, and you'll hear the evidence over the course of the time you have with all the great speakers on why and how you can know Jesus rose from the dead. I did a debate with a guy named John Loftus not too long ago, where we talked about this, and the evidence is overwhelming. It's one of the chief things that got me to become a believer in the first place, was the strength of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. People often ask me, why do you trust Jesus and not Muhammad or Buddha or Krishna or Confucius or anybody else for that matter? And here's my answer. Jesus died claiming he was paying for the sins of the world. And then he rose again to prove he was right. And guys who rise from the dead tend to have credibility. So I believe him. But there's an added issue here. What does it all mean? We were at Yale University, and during the Q&A period, a young man walked up to the microphone, and he said, I get it how truth leads to freedom, I get that, but can you help me with the whole Jesus part? How does Jesus lead to freedom? How is he the truth that leads to freedom? And does the resurrection have anything to do with it whatsoever? I said, okay, I'm so glad you asked, because it does. It does. When you think about what the crucifixion is all about, it's that you and I are made in God's image, and we have marred that image. We have fallen away from what we were intended, and that we owe a debt to God, and Jesus pays that debt. And if he dies and stays dead, you don't know if he really paid that debt or not, but if he rises from the dead, now you do know. But what does he tell you? To this young man, I said, he told me and told you that you are not a neurochemical sophisticated machine. You're not a sophisticated chimp. You are made in God's image. I believe him because he proved that he was right. This is what it means for you and for me, I said. Freedom is the ability to do what you want in accordance with what you should, which is the moral transcendent law, based on what you are, the purpose, once again. And you can know what you are, not a chemical machine, not a really smart animal. You are made in God's image, and it was proven to you. You like that answer? Because the world has been telling them something different. See, one of the things I want to leave you with is that it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. And this young man and countless others I've been in front of have asked hard questions, And we've been on the phone or we've had meetings where they've given their life to Christ because their search was finally answered. They've been misunderstood their whole life, and there are people who are struggling with very serious things, whether it's psychological or intellectual or a combination of both, and they're not understood. But when they finally see that they're understood, that's when the truth starts to sink in deeply. That's what happened to me. Thomas Bracken's poem rings in my head. Not understood, we move along asunder. Our paths grow wider as the seasons creep. We marvel, we wonder why life is life, and then we fall asleep. Not understood. Not understood how many breasts are aching for lack of sympathy. Day by day. Not understood how many lonely hearts are aching, how many noble spirits pass away. Not understood. O God, that men would see a little clearer, or judge less harshly when they cannot see. O God, that men would draw a little nearer to one another. They would draw nearer to thee, and then be understood. The young man was understood. Jesus offers freedom by telling us who we actually are, not what we want. For 2,000 years, we have been trying to find fulfillment in our personal preferences, only to put our faith in things that are neither personal nor true. Isn't that ironic? We try to find our fulfillment based on personal preferences and then put our faith in things that are neither personal nor true. It was the secular band Crash Parallel, Canadian band, secular band, who wrote a song called Rain Delays. And the secular band puts their finger right on the pulse of the problem when they say we're looking for things to fulfill us when we need someone to fulfill us. They say sleepless nights and endless days and mini skirts and serving trays, selling sex for pocket change, waking up from rain delays, and living off the alcohol with no one but a cab to call, lost inside a bathroom stall, this carbon copy life withdrawal. And driving cars we can't afford and making sure we're never bored between coffee grinds and corner stores. And limousines and cigarettes, chasing dreams with fishing nets, long weekends without regrets. Well, no one here is taking bets. Listen to what they say. Because I need someone to believe in. Someone to fill this space with grace, to look into my eyes and touch my face. Someone to make me strong. Someone to make me belong. Someone to make me alive. We don't need something to give us freedom and to give us purpose. We need someone. We've looked for things that are neither personal nor true to satisfy us. And Christ offers us himself because in him, the truth is a person. Let's pray. We'll take questions. Father, we thank you for the truth that you've revealed to us in your Son. We thank you that we can be fulfilled in him. We are satisfied, Lord, in the salvation that we have, but we want to make you our Lord, not just our Savior. Lord, there are many people out there who do not know who your Son is. They are self-made gods, irresponsible and hurting themselves, and you have told them that you have come to set them free. May we be ambassadors for that freedom. May we be ambassadors for that truth. May we know who you are and speak your truth with compassion and not answer questions, but answer people. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay.
We'll take questions, starting this side and then that side and alternate. So just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you.
She hates when I ask these questions.
Oh, great. I can't wait to hear it.
You know, they don't need me to stand up. They can hear me. Some of these issues frustrate and anger me. Mm-hmm. Do you think God gets angry? And if God gets angry with some of the issues, even in the church now, and we probably all know what those issues are, some of the church is saying this is okay now. Mm-hmm. If God gets angry, do we have a right to get angry? And if we do, how do you deal with that? Because even when I pray, it seems like we're losing.
Yeah.
And I hate for Christians and God's not going to lose, obviously, right. In the end. We know that. Right. But sometimes it seems like, to me anyway, mm-hmm. It seems like we're losing ground. And how do you not lose ground? And how do you handle, I mean, besides pray, I know that.
Sure.
It's frustrating.
Well, and I can appreciate it because, you know, I'm the parent of 3 kids who are entering into high school, middle school, and all these things. So I see what's happening. We were talking about this over on the podcast, me and Steve and John talking about this, and the reason why I'm actually hopeful, I get frustrated too, but I'll tell you what I get hopeful at is that there are people who are actually saying, you know what, I'm going to stand up for the truth here, but I'm going to do it in a loving way as much as I possibly can. And I think that when it's lovingly done, it's the hard work. It's very hard to do, but it's worth it every time because no one ever changes their mind because you did this. I've never seen someone change their mind when a fist was shaken at them. I didn't. I was not a likely convert, to sort of paraphrase C.S. Lewis on this. It was when I heard winsome Christians. I remember hearing Greg on the radio one time by accident. I wasn't even a Christian then. I heard Greg on the radio. I'm like, that makes more sense than I'd like it to make. And then heard Ravi and all these things. But no one was shaking their fist. And sometimes we have reason. I think the caution we have to make as Christians is this, is that there's indignation and then there's righteous indignation. And as far as I'm aware, the only human being who had righteous indignation was Jesus. And sometimes the apostles would channel it, like Paul, you could see some of his sarcasm coming through in his letters, where he would be righteously indignant over the people who wanted to shackle other people in the law as opposed to grace. But I'm not an apostle, and so I don't put that right onto myself. I do get worried that if I start to get frustrated, then I will see my enemies as worse than they actually are. And this is a danger. C.S. Lewis, I'm going to paraphrase it, he said something very, very interesting. He said, let's suppose you hear of some atrocity that has occurred by some people you don't like. And then you hear a story about a week later that says, it wasn't quite as bad as we originally thought. What is your first reaction? Is your first reaction to say, oh, thank God, not even they're as bad as that? Or are you disappointed? Do you wish that they were worse than they actually are? The problem with that is you will begin to see white as gray, gray as black, and soon your heart will follow. Now, I'm not saying that any of us who are frustrated are in danger of that, but we could be. We could easily slip into that. I think that we can get angry, not at the people for the things that are happening. I think God is angry. There's judgment. The Bible's full of that, right? But there's also a return to grace. Someone once asked me recently at an atheist forum, I did a forum called Why I'm Not an Atheist, but I Love Their Questions. We only let atheists ask questions. And someone asked about the Old Testament God, and I said, you know what's interesting is you look at the Old Testament God, and what does he do? He tells people, this is what I have for you in store. They rebel against it. His very people, chosen people. He judges, but then he returns to them, even though they aren't even all that repentant. And he gives them chance after chance after chance. I want to be very cautious that we don't stop doing that. God is angry at sin, I think, because it takes people who are made in his image and blinds them to his love. That's what I really think. It's very difficult sometimes to stand in the face of somebody who is, quote unquote, winning, and I don't think that they are, or casting aspersions at your beliefs or even you for saying them, and then look at them and say, I still think you're made in God's image. I still think that. I've often had to remind myself at open forums that the guy who's talking to me right now, or the girl who's yelling, was made in God's image. And God wants her or him to be saved. What I say next is a testimony to whether I actually want to live that. So yes, we can get frustrated and we can get angry, and I think at the situation because it enslaves people. But I'm not angry at people who don't know that they're enslaved. I want to wake them up to their chains. It reminds me of Emily Bronte's poem, The Prisoner. She says, oh, when the soul feels its flesh and the flesh feels its chains. That's what I think good preaching of the gospel is to people, to get them to see that their soul feels its flesh and the flesh feels its chains. I'm not angry at those slaves, because I was a slave too. And in some ways I still am. I'm working on it. God's working on me, but I don't think that those people are any worse off than me. I dare not think that, because I was redeemed as a horrible sinner. Great question. Thank you so much.
On a lot of different online forums, whether you're on social media, even video game chat, and all kinds of things like this, I work with a lot of kids, and I'm on the internet a lot too. Mm-hmm. I wonder how much of the post-truth is based on anonymity, and how do we get people, or even is it our job to get people out from behind this? Because I've done it myself. I know people I've run into, like I've looked at some of their posts, and you can't even see the person sometimes in the anger or just the things you might say online you would never say if you were talking to that person over a coffee.
Yeah.
How do we deal with that and get through it to truth?
Great question. By the way, you win the prize for coolest T-shirt. Or nerdiest, depending on. I'm a super Star Wars nerd, so I'm with you.
I'll take both.
Yeah. This is an excellent question, and I've often thought about this because I have an online presence, and I try to engage a little bit here and there in the back and forth, but it does become depressing because, frankly, people aren't really interested in listening. They're interested in doing the one-liner on you or being as mean as possible because they can be. It's those same people who would never be that way in person. I'm not saying that online changes your character, but it sure does affect it. So how I've actually combated this is that, again, this goes back to the image of God thing. It's very easy to forget that someone is made in God's image when they're not in front of you. But when they are in front of you and you hear their actual voice, it's very hard to read intention in words, and we take offense at the slightest thing. A friend of mine who is a clinical psychologist pointed out that there's studies that show that when you assume the motive of someone and how they act or what they say, we are 90% wrong. That's staggeringly failing. So how much more then by reading what they say, let alone hearing their tone of the voice or seeing their face, right? So how I've done it is I refuse to engage. I don't mean refuse to engage in social media or online. I mean when the question starts to become deep, I tell them, look, here's the phone number to the office. Let's have a call. If they don't want to, then I don't want to either. Because if they don't want to have the call, then I know they're not really interested in having the conversation. Truth isn't what's at stake here anymore. It's who wins in the gladiatorial arena. We are gladiators now. We are no longer truth seekers. And we have to respond to that by not getting involved in the arena, not walking into the Colosseum. Or at least when we're there, realizing this is becoming a bloodbath, and I'm going to withdraw. Does that mean you're going to lose face sometimes? Because someone might say, oh, you're chickening out. Like, whatever. I don't care if you think that. I really don't care. I'm interested in this guy. And if he wants to talk with me or she wants to talk with me, I'm happy to talk on the phone or have a cup of coffee. But if you're not, then I'm not. And sometimes you can't because it's, the whole distance is across the country. But again, these little devices that, can be used for good or for ill, we can use them for good. And they can bridge pretty wide gaps. So I would encourage you to not engage when you can help it. And just make it civil by actually saying, I want to hear your voice. Great question.
Hi, thanks for coming out.
Yeah.
So I'm an engineer, so I work with numbers and math a lot. And so, as you know, it's true or it's not true. The spacecraft lands or it hits the moon kind of thing. Right.
Yeah, post-truth engineers are bad.
I've noticed. So I went to a liberal school, UC San Diego, and it's a good school and everything, but it does breed a lot of liberal thought, like I believe a lot of the UCs do these days. Mm-hmm. And there isn't a lot of serious backlash for it because a lot of the people who do not necessarily think that way are, as you pointed out earlier, drowned out or removed from conversation.
Right.
So my question is when you meet the type of person who necessarily disagrees with the idea of a objective truth, but actively dislikes the idea of objective truth, how can you produce a baseline in a conversation where then you can build upon that and then figure out where the agreement lies and then how you can then talk to the person to make them at least see or understand your point better?
Well, that's a great question. I think that it is context dependent in some ways. For example, if you happen to be talking to a professor in front of a crowd, you're not going to get much agreement at that particular moment. There's a contest happening there. If you are talking to a professor in office hours, it's still a bit of an authority issue. If you're talking to a professor, and I've done this, over lunch that you paid for, it's a little bit easier. And I'm not saying that as a joke. I mean, I'm serious. Take them out to lunch. It's hard to be a jerk when your lunch was paid for. But at the same time, don't be jerky either. I mean, there's an old adage, listen to understand, not respond. Now, you have to respond. Don't get me wrong, you have to respond. But if you listen to collect ammo, they know it. People know that. How many times have you been in a conversation where you're talking and the person's they're nodding, but it's not polite nodding. It's okay, are you done yet? so I can get in? I've got 14 things that you just said that I'm going to contradict right now. That's not a conversation, is it? So listen to understand, not to respond. That's one thing. So listen more than you talk, which is super hard. Because sometimes it's like some of these things you're like, oh, I can't wait till you're done because that's ridiculous. But sometimes it's not. And you might actually find out this person actually knows some stuff. But number two, as you ask questions, as you ask good, thoughtful questions about someone's position, like for example, when someone is avowedly against the idea of objective truth, I'd like to know why that is. Now, a dyed-in-the-wool postmodernist would say the reason why you have a postmodernist movement is because truth claims are really power moves. If I have a truth claim and I want to foist it on somebody else, then I think that my truth claim is better than their truth claim, and the only way to actually win is to eventually use power to dominate somebody. So we got rid of truth claims altogether so we could have quote-unquote conversations, and no one would be dominant over anybody else. So my follow-up question is this. Oh, does that mean that you think human beings are inherently valuable and should be respected? And if the answer is yes, I would follow up the question is that true? Or is it just your opinion? Because it seems to me that if human beings are valuable as a matter of your opinion, then I can treat you like a jerk right now, and you have nothing to say about it. But clearly, you and I both agree on something. I remember I was sitting across the table from a young guy, a very intelligent guy. This context is this. He was African-American young man, adopted and raised by a white family, into a very religious context. But he wanted to find his birth father. And he found his birth father, and he found out his dad was a very militant atheist who thought Christianity was the slaver's religion. So this kid eventually became an atheist himself and thought that Christianity breeds slavery. He sort of subscribed to Sam Harris's view on the moral landscape, that science can tell us what's moral and all these things. So his dad said he'd like to talk to you. You want to have time with him? I said, yeah, absolutely. Let's go over pizza. And again, I'll pay for it, so it becomes easier for me to speak, to be credible. We did. We had 5 hours. I think it was 5 hours, 3 or 5 hours of conversation together. Brilliant young guy, thoughtful, very much cared about social issues in terms of race and inequality. So I said, you know what, here's the thing that I think got the answers that I was talking about sink in. I said, you clearly have a very strong moral streak in you. You clearly value equality, and you hate injustice. I admire you for it. I really do. I see it in you, and I admire you for it. I don't see a basis for this. In other words, that strong sense in you cannot be explained by your neurochemicals. Because a racist has a certain neurochemical system too, and he's not being racist, he's just responding to a stimuli. And so are you. But if it's true that it's wrong to treat people as property, and I know you know it is, there's got to be something more than chemicals and stimuli to tell us that. We had an amazing conversation afterwards, and 3 weeks later I got a little letter from him that says, hey, I started going to an Anglican church, I'm in a Bible study now. Find out what they care about. That's why Paul says it. He says, make the best use of the time. Find out what they care about and why they care about it. What makes them tick? I bet you'd be surprised how often people who say they disavow or hate the idea of objective truth actually don't. They actually don't. They just think they do. And that's not to be insulting or pedestrian about it. It's true. People think that they don't like truth until the truth actually matters, and then they do love it, and they will come to know
it. I was just curious, because last year we had a guy come in, his name was Brent something, and he talked about how there was a study, or there was a professor in Florida who was commenting on when they shot the gorilla over the kid that was being dragged around.
Oh, the Harambe thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was talking about value over that the gorilla should have more value over the child, and then you were just talking about the Australian.
Yeah.
I was just curious, like, how prolific is this? Because it directly conflicts with like our laws. I mean, we value children more than we. And you can't just kill a child because you don't like them. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just wondering, do these people are they trying to move this forward into like I mean, what are they trying to? Is there an objective, or is this just them expressing their feelings, or is that like a movement, and you have to be prepared to kind of address that? Because I just don't run into. I mean, like when I'm dropping my kids off at my elementary school, I don't run into these kind of people.
Right.
That think this stuff. So I'm just curious.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Right. No, but
especially if they're the teachers.
Yeah.
But how prevalent? I'm just wondering how prevalent this is.
Well, it's not very prevalent. I'll tell you that. It's a minority opinion. And in fact, I think Peter Singer, if I'm not mistaken, has sort of backed off a couple of his statements on this stuff a little bit of late, but not completely. My point in bringing it up was this, is that just 2 points in bringing it up. One is that their positions are not inconsistent. So if human beings if human beings are the arbiter of all that's real or true, then we also determine value, because there's no transcendent value giver, therefore there is no transcendent value. It's all a matter of human opinion. So when someone says you can abort a baby at any time in gestation, from fertilization till birth, what's the difference other than geography at that point? The baby is just as cognitively functional outside the womb in the next 15 seconds as it was 30 seconds ago. So what's the difference? If cognitive function becomes the determiner of value, of inherent value, then there's a lot of problems with it. So what I was pointing out was there's a logical consistency that's kind of gruesome that follows from these things. That's the first thing. And the movement is sort of gaining ground, although it is still a decidedly minority position. I mean, you don't run to a lot of professors who think, yeah, we can start, lopping children's heads off because they're in our way. But I don't see a logical inconsistency there either. So I think that and you can be getting there. The law in New York just got passed. I mean, the fact of the matter is that law is ambiguous enough to allow abortion at any time for any reason, even up until birth. So I'm not so sure the slope isn't super greasy. It's not so slippery. It's greased and oiled and got some lotion on it too to get going. And the curve is like this. It's not like that. So here we are. So it's not very prevalent, and you're not going to run into a lot of people on this. But here's another point. When you point this out, though, and you point out the logic that follows, that it's consistent to have this position, people begin to wake up, I think, to say, well, hold on. We're not going to go that far. What's to stop us? What stops us? There's got to be something. When you look at a baby, I mean, when you think about this, Dawkins said that we are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for living. We are machines for propagating DNA. So when you hold a baby in your arms, you ever hold a newborn baby in your arms, and you're looking at this little baby, and you're thinking, it's such this chubby thing where like its eyes are just decoration, kind of a thing. And you're looking at it, and you're thinking, this is such a beautiful little DNA propagator. No one thinks that, right? You just don't think that. None of you coiffed yourselves to come to work or to come here today and thought, I am a well-dressed DNA machine. You don't think that. You recognize something inherently valuable about yourself. So when you point out some of these thinkers and the consistency with which they make these arguments, I think it can shock people, not in a harsh way, but at least in some way, to wake up from the fog and the malaise that's around them. That's what I would say is the value in that. I sort of look like I'm totally confused. The live stream must be thinking, what's that guy looking at? I'm just looking for the hands to go up.
So I have two questions,
Yes, please.
kind of on a different topic, more with Islam.
Mm-hmm.
The first question is, when you were growing up Muslim, what was the hardest thing in maybe intellectual or family structure and stuff from coming from Islam to Christianity? And the second thing is, I'm in like dialogues with a lot of Muslims,
Yep.
and when you go about discussing like the deity of Jesus and the Trinity, like I find that is so often just immediately like walls come up. How do you go about discussing that with fellow Muslims?
So those two questions for me are actually super intertwined because those two things were the biggest stumbling blocks. So when you talk to a Muslim, for example, here's the four things you'll get objections to Christianity, because they're also, at least in the Muslim mind, extremely hard to respond to. This is a truism, by the way. Objections are easy to raise. Answers are hard to explain. Not because the answers themselves are sort of rationalized. They're just it's easy to say, if there's a God, why is there suffering? Well, that took me 3 seconds, but an actual answer requires thought and these kind of things. So Muslims often raise objections to the Christian faith that sound extremely pithy and devastating and short. But their shortness seems to suggest, my goodness, you could dismantle my faith in 3 seconds? They didn't. They just challenged it in 3 seconds. So for me, when I was considering the claims of Christianity, at first I thought that the ideas, the 4 objections to Christianity were just nails in the coffin. One was the accuracy of the Bible and the transmission of the Bible through the centuries. I thought it was corrupted. Muslims believe this, by the way. Muslims believe that the Bible was once, at least parts of the Bible, the Taurat, which is the Torah, the Injil, the Gospel of Jesus, the Zabur, the Psalms of David, that these were actually revealed by God but became corrupted over time, and the Quran came to fix all those corruptions. Okay? So that's what Muslims believe. So I thought that the Bible was corrupted. And I would use Bart Ehrman to shore up my arguments whenever I talked to a Christian. And I even say, even one of your own scholars, because he was white and not Jewish, I thought he was Christian, would say that the Bible has changed. The Trinity, I thought that this was an absolutely, completely goofy idea. Like, God is 1 and 3, come on. And then the incarnation of God in Christ, how can God be both limited and unlimited? That doesn't make any sense. And then the cross, I thought was the ultimate insult to God. I mean, you have the God of the universe who creates everything. He gets trapped in a body that dies at the hands of the very sinners he created. For me, the biggest issue, the biggest stumbling block was that all of these things seem to suggest that God was not truly great. Now, you've heard the phrase, right? When you see a Muslim on TV or whatever, and unfortunately you see it only in the context of terrorism, but Muslims will say, Allahu Akbar, right? And you're slightly nervous because the Arab guy said it in the crowd. It's a terrible joke. You shouldn't laugh at that, sinners. That phrase means God is greater. It literally means God is bigger, but the connotation is God is greater. Muslims say this all the time when they walk into a home and they see how beautiful the house is. They say, oh, Allahu Akbar, God is great for blessing you. Or they'll get a bad news, and they'll say, Allahu Akbar, God is greater than my circumstances. God's greatness is the central idea of all of Islam. So I thought the Trinity insulted God's greatness because if God is great, if God the Father is great, why does he need help from the Father and the Son? From the Son and the Spirit. He wouldn't need help if he's truly great. The incarnation of God is silly because why would he become trapped in a body that doesn't know things? That doesn't seem like a great God. And then he would die at the hands of his very sinners that he created. That doesn't seem like a great God either. So it was my exploration of these things as a Christian, as a Muslim, that got me to see that the Trinity, incarnation, and cross actually demonstrate God's greatness. So I want to sustain that for you for a moment here. It's a good question, but give me a minute, okay? On the Bible, my guess is the Muslims you've talked to have immediately told you the Bible's not trustworthy. One of the first things they tell you is that. As a Muslim, they can't believe that. As a Muslim, you cannot believe it. Okay, remember what I said, God is great, right? God is the greatest possible being. He is the greatest possible being there could be. If he's the greatest possible being, then he would possess at least 2 qualities. He would be all-powerful, and he'd be trustworthy. Okay? All-powerful and trustworthy. If the Bible, or parts of the Bible, were once God's word, as Muslims claim, but became corrupted, either he couldn't prevent the corruption, or he wouldn't prevent the corruption of Scripture. If he couldn't prevent it, then he's not all-powerful. He's not all-powerful, then he's not great. If he's not great, then you shouldn't be a Muslim. If he could have prevented the corruption of Scripture, but he wouldn't, that's a problem too, because he said he would, and he went back on that. And then why would you have any confidence whatsoever that he would keep the Quran from becoming corrupted? He's not batting 1,000. He let 3 scriptures become corrupted. Why trust him in the last one? Why trust that? So if he's not capable of preventing the corruption, he's not powerful and therefore not great. If he's not willing, he's not trustworthy and therefore not great. But every Muslim believes that God is great, so they must believe that God could, God would, and the history shows God did prevent the corruption. So I would lay it with them. I wrestled with that for years, trying to find a third alternative. I still haven't found one. If you can think of one, please let me know, but I have not found a third one. That's one. In that uncorrupted Scripture, and I read about this, by the way, in my book, Grand Central Question. I have a whole section on this. In that uncorrupted Scripture, Jesus teaches that he is the Son of God who dies on a cross, rises from the dead, and that incarnation is the second person of the Trinity, God the Son. So we go to the Trinity. Again, God's greatness is the lens through which I look at this. Christians often say things like God is one and three. You got to make sure you qualify that and talk about that a little more in depth than just saying God is one and three, because that sounds like a contradiction. And nakedly it is. But if it's more than that, if you understand the distinction between something's nature and something's person, it loses its contradictory sort of sense to it. So if I were to hold this up and I would say, what is this? You'd say phone, whatever, but let's say, what is it in its nature? It's a non-living thing. It's a thing. It's a non-living thing. You could point at the person next to you and say, point at me and say, what is that? Which is semi-insulting, but you could say it. It's sociologically to say, what is that thing looking at me? I have a nature as well. I'm a living thing. Okay? I have a nature. Or physical being, whatever you want to say. But you can't look at the phone and say, who is that? I know we give it names and stuff now, but if you talk to it too long, they take you away, right? It doesn't have who-ness. It has no personhood. It's got a nature, but no personhood. But you can say to me, who is that? I have a personhood as well. So when we say God is one in his nature and three in his persons, we're not saying he's one in one way and three in the same way. We're saying he's one in his whatness and three in his who-ness. So he's got three centers of consciousness, as it were. Now, do you understand that 100%? Of course you don't. You know why? You're not tripersonal. Do you know what it means to never have begun? And every Muslim believes that God is uncreated. So you can understand philosophically that there could be an uncreated being, but do you know what it's like to be uncreated? Of course you don't, because you swim in the stream of time. You began. So if Muslims have something about God they can't fully explain, and Christians do, what's the problem? In fact, let me go one further. If you believe in a God who looks just like us, we're one in nature and one in person, and God is one in nature and one in person, I begin to wonder who made who. Because if your God is so simple that you can explain him like that, and Muslims say that all the time, Islam, it's simple, you don't need a PhD in philosophy to understand it. Well, then maybe your God's not big enough. Maybe he's too easy to understand. But there's more to it. There's more to it than that. If God is truly great, I think God must be a triune being. Think about this. Muslims believe that God is the uncreated being, the only uncreated being there is. Everything else was created. So far, I agree. Christians agree with that. God is uncreated, everything else is created. If that's the case, and God is relational, there's a problem. See, the Quran has what are called the 99 names of God. The 99 names of God are almost all relational. He is Al-Adil, which is the just. He is Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim. He is the beneficent. He is the merciful. He is Al-Wadud, which means the lovingly kind one. These are fundamental characteristics of who God actually is. He is inherently, in Islam, relational. And of course, in the Bible, we have God as loving, and all these, God is love, right? So far we agree, uncreated being who is relational in and of himself. That is his nature. Here's the problem. If God is one in his nature and one in his person, and he is uncreated, then there was a state of affairs in which all there was God. He was incapable of being relational towards anything. He needed to create something outside of himself to be relational towards. Relationship always requires an object. No one walked into this room and said, I love. Well, what do you love? I don't know, I just love. No one just loves. You gotta love someone, you gotta love something, right? Otherwise, it's ridiculous. It's weird. You could say, oh, I love myself. That's kind of like a Ted Bundy kind of love, though, right? I mean, that's super shallow. The Trinity solves the problem. You see, if God needs to create something in order to be who he is, then he needs something. And if he needs something, then he's not the greatest possible being. The Trinity says God and the Father loves the Son loves the Spirit loves the Father and the Son, and on it goes from eternity in the community of the Trinity. He never needs anything because he defines relationship, which is why 1 John chapter 4, verse 8 says God is love. Not that God is loving, but God is love. And this leads to a beautiful conclusion, I think. Why make you? Why do you exist? He doesn't need you for a relationship. He's not lonely. He's got a perfect relationship within himself. So why create us to mess it up? I think here's how I look at it. God did not create you so he could have a relationship. He created you so that you could have it. And that is selfless. He's not more God because you exist. But out of the abundance of what it means to be a being who defines love, he creates creatures who are capable of loving him back and or at least have the opportunity of loving him back through his grace. If you want to know a God who is great, that's him. Sorry, the other one just doesn't add up, doesn't measure up. But then we come to the cross. First of all, it's historical. The Quran denies its historicity. And if you deny one of the most verifiable facts of ancient history, then your book is suspect. That's the first thing. But second thing is that it doesn't humiliate God at all. Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest possible being. I remember where I was when I first realized what the cross really means. If God is the greatest possible being, then he would express the greatest possible ethic, which is love. And he would do it in the greatest possible way. He wouldn't do it half-baked. He would do it in the greatest possible way. What's the greatest possible way to express love? It's not a mystery, it's sacrifice. Now, you and I can do that. And we're creatures. How can we be more morally perfect than God? If God is truly our creator, then he would at least be capable of doing at least what we can do in terms of moral expression of love. But God is greater than we are, so he expresses it greater than we do. You and I sacrifice for people who love us back, once in a while for strangers, but we don't do it for enemies. When Osama bin Laden was killed, did anybody in this room say, boy, I wish I could take his place? Our love has limits. It has limits. Romans chapter 5, verse 8. I remember where I was when I read the words for the first time. For God demonstrates his love, his great love, his unsurpassed love, selfless love, in that while we were sinners, God haters, Christ died for us. The greatest possible being, expressing the greatest possible ethic in the greatest possible way. If God is truly great, and every Muslim believes that, then he must be a triune God who incarnates himself and gives of himself so that we can be saved. What's greater than that? That's what I would say. Thank you.
Hold on.
You're next. That sounded like a threat, didn't it?
I'm going to start my question like yours did at the beginning as a negative statement. I've taught school quite a few years, and I have seen a growing sense of non-intellectualism in students. They're becoming apathetic to the extreme in things that are intellectual.
Yeah.
Here's my question. You talk to intelligent people. Your speech tonight was very high level. I appreciate that. Many of my students would have no clue what you're talking about, nor could they follow your reasoning. I know that sounds very negative, but based on my not data, just my intuition, my experiential things. Then you mentioned transhumanism and artificial intelligence. You didn't mention it, but it's involved in that.
Sure.
My question is this. I think perhaps we're in not a post-truth, beginnings of a post-truth. We're in the post-truth. But what if we become in the post-thinking age? What do we do with that when robots and artificial intelligence take over? How do we prepare for that?
It reminds me of a quote I heard. The name is escaping me right now. I'm sorry. But a writer once said, the problem is not that Johnny doesn't know what to think or Johnny doesn't know how to think. Johnny doesn't know what thinking is. Now, that's not an insult of a generation. I mean, one of the things that I think happens with older generations is that we get accused of generation bashing. And they deserve it a little bit. But we deserve it too. I mean, there's some things too. By the way, the generation is the way it is because of us. I mean, let's put the blame a little bit where it goes. There's a flabbiness in terms of some intellectual engagement, and I appreciate what you're saying, and I would agree with it. However, I do think this. Children rise to the level of expectations you give them. If it's low, that's where they'll stay. If it's high, they'll go there. They tend to do that. There was a study that was done where they told kids, they gave kids some problems. They give this set of kids some problems and this set of kids some problems. And they both finished it. And they basically had the same scores. But they told group A, boy, you guys are really smart. Man, you guys are so smart. They told group B, you guys work really hard. They gave them another test. Group B did better than group A. Because group A was coddled in one sense, thinking, oh, I don't need to work hard and try my best. I'm gifted. as opposed to group B, who was told they work hard. I also think there's a moral element to that, because in one sense, intelligence is an arbitrary gift. Like, I didn't ask to be smart or tall or dumb or whatever. I didn't ask for that. But hard work is something you can do about it. And when you infuse sort of an ethic and a character into these things, they try harder. And they will achieve greater, even when they're told that they're smart. That encouragement doesn't always work. And I think one thing that we're experiencing right now is a path of least resistance kind of a culture, where it's like, well, you're bright and you're smart and all these things, and no one fails in this school, and we don't give bad grades and all that stuff, and so there's a malaise that occurs. But I'll tell you what else happens. I think that these little machines, and I keep bagging on them a little bit, but I'll tell you this, as the parent of children of this age, these things are motivation drainers. It's not that they're not smart kids. They are smart kids. It's that they have no motivation. You know how easy it is to pick up one of these things and distract yourself? What David Bentley Hart calls imbecile distractions? It's not because the people are imbeciles, but it creates this whole thing where it's like it's easy to do these things. It's easy. I mean, you take a kid who's like, let's say, a gifted musician. He could go and practice his guitar or his piano, and it would take him an hour to get the sense of satisfaction out of, oh, I got my scales right, or I did whatever it was right. Or he could pick up a video game thing and get instant gratification now. It's human nature to go with number two. So I think that's part of the problem. We also have low expectations of our kids, I think, nowadays, because we want life to be easy for them. And the machines are making it easier and easier. I think that's a problem. I think the solution is essentially to go back to what people used to do, and they used to force it to be hard. Having it being hard is a good thing. They will not break. They won't hate you. They'll actually probably love you for it. I think that we're so terrified of that. That's one thing. That's a social commentary thing to all of this. But again, I go back to the hope of this. If I speak at youth conferences, I find that they're leaning in. And they may not get everything, but they do get quite a bit. You'd be surprised. You'd be very surprised at what they pick up. And sometimes the questions they ask, I've been asked questions by 13-year-olds that far outstrip the profundity of anything I got from an adult. Like, whoa, that was a good question. So you'd be surprised. But it's all there. We just have to encourage it, because right now we're making them flabby. We're helping them be flabby. And it's human nature to want to be flabby. So a little resistance goes a long way. Excellent question.
And it's 8 o'clock, so if you got kids, you got to go get them. Have fun. Yeah, see, now nobody's owning their kids.
Is one in the back there, guys, I think? Or was there one up here? Oh, yeah. I promised you to be next.
Excuse me. If you look in Genesis 28 or 26, it said, let us. What do the Muslims believe the let us is as far as God?
Well, first, they would deny the whole thing at all, because Muslims do not believe you were created in God's image. So it says, let us create man in our own image, after our own likeness. Muslims would deny that. That people are made in God's image is almost blasphemous to a Muslim. Now, having said that, the Quran actually refers to God in using us and we all the time. The reason, though, is because by that time in the development of Semitic language, and Arabic is a Semitic language, it's very similar to Hebrew, there was a category called the royal we. And you'll see this, by the way, if you ever read something of like a king or a queen would say. They wouldn't say, I am pleased. They'd say, we are pleased. There's this whole idea of there's an added weight if you're somehow singularly referred to in the plural. It's an added weight to the majesty of that, and that's true. Now, I've heard scholars say this, and I haven't checked it out, but I'm pretty sure this is right. So check it out yourself. By the time Genesis was written, there was no such thing as a royal we. So when it says, let us make man in our image, that royal we didn't exist in Hebrew. The concept developed later. I think it was James White who pointed that out. So if they were to look at that, they'd say, oh, it's like in the Quran, it's a royal we. Well, wait a minute, you're taking Islamic idea and you're imposing it upon a non-Islamic text. Why don't we understood it the way the first hearers understood it? That would give us the most plain definition, wouldn't it? Instead of infusing on it or superimposing on it a interpretation we want to have. So they would say royal. I would say it's not so much that. Now, because the Bible says, let us make man in our image, does not prove that God's a Trinity. It doesn't prove that. The Trinity is proved by a cumulative case, I think chiefly in the New Testament, but also in the Old. I mean, you have some amazing things spoken of in the Old where God refers to himself in the plural all the time. Whether it's let us make man in our image, or even in the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. It literally says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your gods, the Lord is unified. That's what echad in Hebrew can mean, unified. In fact, usually it means unified. In fact, when Adam and Eve, when it says, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, that word is not yachid. Yachid means one. Echad means unified. And that's the same word used of God. When the spies go into the land of Canaan, they bring back a cluster of grape. They bring back an echad of grapes, a unified whole of grapes. So that's interesting all by itself. Does it prove the Trinity? No, but it does give hints. Then you begin to see in the Psalms, and you see in Isaiah, and you see in Ezekiel, and you see all through the New Testament that God is referred to in a plural sense. So I think this is a cumulative case for the Trinity on top of the philosophical case and even the theological case I gave earlier.
And how about the Jews? What would they think on us?
They would tend to say it's a royal we. Yeah, I think that they're wrong about that. But here's an interesting thing. There's a book by a scholar named Daniel Boyarin called Two Powers in Heaven. And he, in a very scholarly way, points out how early Jews, even pre-Christian Jews, thought about God at least in a duality, as a binitarian God, not necessarily Trinitarian, but a binitarian God. They understood that there was something of a plurality in God. Early Jews did. So it wasn't just a Christian idea. They didn't invent it. It was actually there already, which is important because a lot of Muslims would say, well, if the Trinity was so obvious, why didn't Jews believe it? Well, some of them did, even before Jesus. Which is, I think, a tremendous thing. When I found that, I was like, wow, that's cool. Yep.
I loved your speech, by the way. Just thank you for that.
Oh, thanks.
And how you articulate things is really nice. I've got a question about the virgin birth, because I know it's a very common thing that I hear in atheist circles, that this isn't an uncommon thing that Jesus came of a virgin. Like, this has been there, done that kind of concept that's been around before. So how do you respond to people that believe that? And also people who believe that the idea of a resurrection as well has happened in the past. So how does this really set Jesus apart?
So the common way to look at this is that Christianity is a copy of ancient mystery religions like the cult of Mithra, like Osiris and Horus and all these various things where you have these dying and rising gods. They have 12 disciples, and one's killed and he's buried and he rises from the dead. And that all predates Christianity, which means it's all a big hoax. A couple things wrong with that. When you look at the actual stories, the rumors of the parallels have been greatly exaggerated. Like, one of the gods doesn't die and rise from the dead. He dies and stays that way and becomes the god of the underworld. Well, that's not the same thing, even close to the Christian view of what happened with Jesus. The 12 disciples thing, not true. I think it was 25 disciples, something like that. It wasn't even close. I mean, these things are not parallel at all. Plus, when you look at the facts, oftentimes when you look at the source documentation, such as we have it, we don't have a whole lot, we understand that these things arose after Christianity. So if anybody borrowed, it was them, not Christianity. So it's exactly the opposite. It's anachronistic to say that Christianity borrowed from those things. And Greg, I'm going to borrow something I've heard you say before, that parallels don't mean anything. Doesn't disprove a thing. So I'll tell you a story. There's a story of this ship. It was built in the late 1800s, and it was unsinkable. And it was, you've probably heard this. Am I telling you something you already heard? All right, well, you know what I'm talking about, so I'll tell you, because you didn't hear it probably. I'm just going to talk to you now. So there's a ship that's unsinkable, okay, 800 and something feet long, the largest passenger ship ever created. It was fast, it had a really small rudder, and it was traveling across the North Atlantic in April. And the captain wanted to break a record by getting across the North Atlantic from London to New York. And because he was going so fast and the rudder was small, he hit an iceberg. And because there weren't enough lifeboats, more than half the people on the ship died. What am I talking about? No, I'm talking about a fictional ship called the Titan. There was a story called Futility, or the Wreck of the Titan, that was written years before the Titanic sank. And it described the ship in exactly those ways, in exactly the same sort of level of detail. It's crazy. I mean, the numbers aren't exact, but they're super close. So here's the problem. Do we now see the Titan as disproving that the Titanic sank because of this crazy coincidence? No. So let's say we have at least one story that parallels Jesus. And what? All the eyewitness accounts mean nothing. All the evidence we have for the resurrection mean nothing. Parallelism doesn't equate to falsehood. It just equates to a weird coincidence, possibly. Other things aren't even parallel in the first place. So that's what I would say in response to that. These are often objections, again, that sound very pithy and easy to make, but it's based on faulty information. And the question is the person you're responding to willing to hear the response? And if they're willing to hear it, then you're going to get some headway. But if they're not, and they're just sort of, they watch the Zeitgeist movie and they can't wait to tell you how much they know, it's going to be a bit more difficult challenge. But you can do it. And the Titan one is one of those things that I think is just dynamite, because it's like we know these two things that book was fictional and the account of what happened to Titanic actually really happened. Another question? In the back there.
Yeah, I appreciated you talking about post-truth. That's the first time I may have heard people say post-truth, but your distinction between post-truth and postmodernism was the first time I've heard it articulated that way. And it made me think, I'm a super advocate of apologetics, whatever side of it you come down on. But it almost seems like in a post-truth world, apologetics almost is lowered in a level of effectiveness. It seems like we're being outmaneuvered on a grand spiritual sense, and that the population and society is almost under a form of mind control in a sense, but it's a spiritual mind control by who controls the power of the age.
Yeah.
So obviously I think you have to be able to answer these questions that you just answered and things like that. But how do we keep in mind as Christians a focus on evangelism using, I think it was on apologetics.com, I just heard they were saying apologetics is almost kind of like the artillery that softens the heart to where you can get to these things. But it seems like we're being outmaneuvered as a grand scale other than the kingdom will stand, the gates of hell won't prevent the kingdom. But as individuals, it seems like we need to be effective on an individual level, but we're being completely outmaneuvered societal, and I don't see a way for us to engage the world system for a change, if that makes sense.
Sure, I understand.
Hopefully there was a question in there somewhere.
Yeah, I get it. I'm pretty sure I get it. And if I don't, please pipe up and let me know that I've gone off the rails there. Let me say this. The fact that we're in a post-truth culture that elevates preferences over truth is actually a left-handed compliment to apologetics in some way. See, what you have to do in order to avoid the force of the argument is simply subordinate it in terms of its importance. It's not a very clever maneuver, frankly, if you think about it. So I present to somebody a very, very powerful argument that touches on something that might contradict what they care about, or it touches what they care about, but it contradicts what they wish was true. So how do you avoid that? You can either come back with facts. If you don't have any, you can either ignore what I said, or you can lie about it. There's a soft mode of post-truth and a hard mode. The hard mode simply lies about, and I go in the book into all this. The hard mode of post-truth simply lies about the facts. It just simply lies about it because my agenda matters more than the truth for now. And my agenda is so lofty that we can murder the truth a little bit and it'll be okay. The soft mode just ignores the truth altogether, or at least downplays its significance. That might seem like an outmaneuvering, but in reality, take heart, because in some ways it's actually a compliment, because if I can't come back with something that's intellectually sound to what you've said, I have to avoid it. And so what I would say is we have to come back to a position, whether it's an individual evangelism, and don't downplay the effectiveness of individual evangelism. The fact of the matter is that the world changed the minute Paul converted. The fact of the matter is that when Peter was asked 3 times, "Do you love me?" and he finally realized what was going on in the questioning, the world changed. So don't downplay the reality of individual evangelism. The fact that professors were individually talking to students at major universities and changing their worldviews into this postmodernism, which is now post-truth, was en masse, but sometimes it was actually quite individual. So don't downplay it. It's actually pretty effective. So one, it's a compliment to the strength, I think, of truth's existence, but also, I think, even Christian truth. But two is getting to motive. And I'm a big believer in this. If someone had gotten to my motives before I knew what they were, by realizing it over time, I would have become a Christian probably a lot faster. Now, I don't know that for a fact. I just have a suspicion that that's the case. It took me 9 years. 9 years from bang the bullets, from the time I got first a faithful Christian witness, where I was hit in the face with the fact that I was not being objective with Christianity. I was being very biased and very partial. And by the way, this is interesting all by itself. You know who convinced me that I was being that way? That I was swallowing everything Islam said about itself and about Christianity and not taking into account anything objectively about Christianity itself? John the Baptist. The Bible, the Bible's words got me that way. When he said to those who were coming to him to be baptized, he said, do not even think to yourself you have Abraham as your father, as if that would save them from God's wrath. For I tell you, God can raise up children of Abraham from the stones. What he was saying is tradition does not save you. Well, I was suddenly realizing I believed something, and I had gotten all the evidence that I could marshal, not because I thought it was actually true in and of itself, but because I needed it to be true, because it was my tradition. And that started the journey. But it took 9 years from the start to the finish. And it wasn't because the answers were hard to find. They were there. It's because the answers are hard to accept. And that's, I think, what gets to the heart of things. When Jesus tells the rich young ruler, when the guy says, what must I do to be saved? Jesus asks him a couple questions. And then in Mark, he says this beautiful little phrase we often miss. After the guy says, I've done all these things since birth. I'm a wonderful observant Jew. Jesus says, and the Bible says, and loving him, Jesus said, you lack one thing. Loving him, he pointed out something he was missing. And it was all about motivation. All about motivation. So I've asked people, I've sat across the table from people, and I've asked them this question. I said, let me assume for a moment that I could prove to you that Christianity was true. Just assume it. I know you don't believe it right now. Let's assume it for a moment. Let me assume further that you now thought it was worth believing and embracing, and you became a Christian right now. What would happen next? And don't say one more word. They might say, what do you mean? What do you happen next? Like, well, when you told your parents or you told your colleagues that you believe in Jesus and he's your Savior, would it be a party? Would they think you lost your mind? What would happen next? And then when they fill in some of the blanks, and they might not be willing to do it at first, you might want to ask them a follow-up question. Those are heavy prices to pay. Isn't it possible that the price you have to pay blinds you to the reality of what I'm saying? Maybe you're not being as open-minded as you think you are. When you think about what the moon actually is. The moon is this cold, dead rock, right? It's 1/6 the mass of the Earth. 1/6 the mass of the Earth. It's millions of times smaller than the sun. Yet for some reason, when it comes in front of the sun, because it's 400 times closer than the sun and 400 times smaller in diameter than the sun, it blocks out the sun perfectly. Now, it's a dazzling display, but darkness falls over everything. How is it that this cold, dead rock blocks out the sun's radiance? The reason why the cold, dead rock blocks out the sun's radiance is because it's so close to us. We have a personal price in accepting the truth, and we hold it very, very close. I did for 9 years. I held that cold, dead rock of the consequences of truth close to my heart, and it blocked out the glorious sun God had provided for me. It was when Christians actually pointed this out to me that maybe I'm holding on to something. Not because it's true, because I don't want it to be true. When that finally moved and I could see him for who he really was. Is it easy to do? Absolutely not. Is it going to take a lot of work? You bet. But we didn't come here overnight either. And the floodgates have been opened. But if you can actually show someone that they reject what you're saying based on their preferences, and you can actually get them to see it. John Stott says that true evangelism happens when we get people to hear with their eyes so they can see what we're saying. Now, he's not saying that imagery and all these things. He's just saying that people have to fully understand what we're saying. And if you reach them at the heart level, I've seen it every time. I've seen it happen time and again. People will listen. They may not always agree, but they will give you a hearing. That's why Paul says it. He says, answer people, not questions. Is it hard to do? Yeah. Are we being outmaneuvered? I don't think so. I just think that our maneuvers take a little bit longer. It's a long game. It's not a short game. You can whack the ball and get huge drives, but if your short game isn't very good and you can't putt, you're going to lose. It's the whole game. So don't let the post-truth culture intimidate you. Don't let it. Let me just tell you a story, and then I'll wrap it up unless there's another question. I'm happy to talk for a little bit, but this is a good point, I think, to end on. There's a story that's circulated in the Navy for a long time as true. It's not true, but at least I don't think it's true. But it's a story of these ships that were crossing the North Atlantic on a very dark and foggy night. And it was, they see a light right in front of them. And this light's directly in the path, and so the captain of the lead ship signals over and says, change your course 15 degrees to the south, it's 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. And the guy comes back and says, nah, you move. And the captain's like, oh, I'm not moving. So change your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision, confirm. The guy says, you change your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. And the captain's now, he's pretty upset. He says, this is the captain of the USS Abraham Lincoln. We are the second largest ship in the North Atlantic U.S. naval fleet. We are accompanied by 5 destroyers and numerous support vessels. If you do not move your course 15 degrees, that's 15 degrees to the south, we will undertake countermeasures to ensure the safety of this vessel, including the use of force. Confirm. The guy comes back and says, this is a lighthouse. Your call, man. Now, here's my point. Here's this little light. It seems like it defies the power. Look at all the power in those ships. All the power in those ships is just floating. Their guns, their artillery have nothing compared to the land mass of North America. Just nothing compared to it. Yet it seems so intimidating. But here's the interesting part about that story. That lighthouse did not exist to defy the power. That lighthouse existed to save it. That's what it means to offer truth in a post-truth world. You are not there to defy and shake your fist. You are there to point a light out and say, you're going to crash. Now, it might be one ship at a time, or it might be a whole flotilla of them, but it can be done. I know it's daunting, but don't let your light go out. Put it on a hill. People want to see it. They will want to see what you have to say. Guys, it's been a true pleasure. Thank you so much. God bless you.